Welcome, everyone. So yeah, on the Brain Inspired podcast, I have people like Matt on to talk about this very kind of topic. So Matt's going to talk. Matt's from DeepMind, for those of you who don't know, and he's going to talk about deep reinforcement learning and its neuroscientific implications. So Matt, take it away.
All right, let me get my slides on screen. Are those showing up?
Yes.
Great. Okay. Thanks, Paul. Yeah, and thanks everyone for having me. I'm really excited to be participating. We worked out kind of a cool format for this session. So I'm just going to give a half-hour talk, just sort of reviewing some points that I've made with some of my colleagues recently in a paper on deep reinforcement learning, and then we're going to have a panel discussion, which I'm really looking forward to. So, all right, so deep reinforcement learning. Obviously, a very important piece of the background for this whole meeting is the computational framework of reinforcement learning, which has over the last 20 years given us a really invaluable reference point and kind of source of ideas and hypotheses for understanding dopaminergic function and motivated behavior in general. Of course, the famous connection between the phasic dopaminergic signaling and the reward prediction error is front and center here, but when I use the term reinforcement learning, I'm also using it the way that the original authors of the primer use it to describe not a particular algorithm like temporal difference learning, but the whole problem of choosing actions to maximize reward. And so that spans things like model-based reinforcement learning as well. And there's no need to explain to this audience how useful reinforcement learning has been to scientific studies of goal-directed behavior and learning in the brain. For me, I found the connection between biology and computational reinforcement learning particularly satisfying because it connects physiological phenomena with what I see as one of the core aspects of intelligence, which is its cognitive nature. That is to say, its goal-directedness, its the role of motivation, the fact that biological agents want things and have preferences over things, and that guides their actions. Some of you will be familiar with this paper that just came out from DeepMind. I'm not necessarily endorsing it, it's a rather extreme view, but it makes the case that this cognitive aspect of intelligence is really fundamental. But of course, as many of us who've employed reinforcement learning tools in neuroscience are painfully aware, there have been some limitations to the tools that computational reinforcement learning provides us. And one of the main limitations has been in state representation. So for many years, most RL applications, either in machine learning or in neuroscience, use very impoverished representations of the agent state or the environmental situation. Many of you will be familiar with a good old tabular representation, which simply says every state is completely independent and unrelated to every other state. It's just what gives us classic grid worlds. And these are very nice to have if you just want to estimate a value function. We can do the same thing in time and discretize things in an unoverlapping way to get a complete serial compound. Again, very useful if you want to efficiently estimate a value function. However, these sort of orthogonalized representations give us nothing to go on if what we want to understand is something like generalization or transfer to new task environments. There's no similarity structure among these kinds of representations, and therefore there's no basis on which to say, oh, well, this situation I'm in is not one I've encountered exactly before, but it's similar to familiar situations in this way and that way, and therefore I can make the following estimate of action values and so forth. There's been all sorts of efforts to handcraft representations for reinforcement learning that have a little bit more of that that kind of overlapping similarity and similarity structure, but it's been heavy going, and that's left us pretty much enfeebled when it comes to looking at the other core aspect of intelligence, which you might call the cognitive side. The side of intelligence that is about representing the world in useful ways and establishing knowledge that is repurposable, that can be reused in what would otherwise appear to be completely novel circumstances. There are other computational tools that allow us to think productively and model cognitive phenomena. One that stood the test of time in cognitive science and neuroscience is, of course, artificial neural networks, or as they're now sometimes referred to, deep learning systems. But up until recently, artificial neural networks or deep learning systems have been trained almost exclusively with supervised learning. And so there hasn't been an opportunity to connect this tool for studying the cognitive side of cognition, of intelligence, with the conative side that's addressed by reinforcement learning. People had the idea a long time ago, back in the 90s, that maybe there might be some way of combining these or integrating these two computational frameworks. There's famous work by Jerry Tesaro in which he managed to get a deep learning system to train using a reinforcement learning algorithm and to get the whole thing to play a respectable game of backgammon. And the fact that there was a deep learning system involved allowed this agent to deal with board configurations that it had never encountered exactly before. But the problem was that the techniques that were introduced in this particular line of work didn't seem to generalize. They were too brittle. They tended to diverge in other domains. But that all changed in about 2015. And the shot heard around the world, I guess you could say, is this paper that came out of DeepMind. This is before I arrived, sad to say. Here, researchers were able to take the kind of approach that Tesaro had introduced and add some things like replay, inspired, by the way, by neuroscience, to stabilize the whole thing and allow it to converge to good results, yielding superhuman performance on these classic Atari games. What's involved here was very simple. It's just the same kind of convolutional neural networks that many people are now using to model ventral stream activity in biological brains, but training them instead with reinforcement learning. So you feed in a pixel level representation of the screen, deep convolutional neural network, you train it with a reward prediction error to update value estimates, and that's the whole story. That was the first successful application of DeepRL, but since then, all sorts of elaborations have been made. There's been an explosion of research in this area, of course, in AI. One well-known elaboration was to create an interface between model-free RL, of the kind that was involved in the Atari system, and tree search, in other words, model-based RL, and it's that combination that yielded superhuman performance in board games like chess and Go. Another innovation was to use recurrent neural networks instead of feed-forward neural networks, so now we have sustained activity over time, effectively a working memory system inside these DeepRL agents, allowing them to deal with environments that are partially observable, playing games like capture the flag. Other work has built in memory mechanisms that are more like episodic memory, that work like slot-based RAM-style memories that allow information about observations to be gated into memory quite efficiently and to be read out even after long delays. Compositional representation and computation is now becoming more feasible as with the introduction of transformer architectures. Many of you will know about those from language modeling work. They've been used now to get DeepRL to scale to much richer game domains like StarCraft. And then there's also continuous control. So there have been rapid advances in applying DeepRL in robotics, And also in simulation, we have better and better physics engines that allow us to do things like build simulations, biophysically realistic simulations of animal bodies, and then train them with RL to do things like get a realistic wing motion in a flying fruit fly model, or a realistic running and jumping in a detailed rodent model. So these are behaviors that were learned with reinforcement learning, deep reinforcement learning, and then to build hierarchies of action through RL to get results like the ones shown here in humanoid soccer. So I mean, these are all advances that live in the engineering or AI world, but I think they're important for us as neuroscientists because they provide a computational context for us to think about the interface of these two core aspects of intelligence, the cognitive or motivational, and the cognitive, or the side that involves world knowledge. And because we're bringing these two things together under one hood, we get to think about how they relate to one another, how they interact. So we get to think about how representations of the world form a basis for goal-directed decision-making, and we get to think about how motivation and reward can shape representations of the world. And of course, because reinforcement learning is an essential part of the picture, there's a way for us to think in this context about, through analogy, as it were, to the role of dopamine in the brain. But we get to think about that role in a new way, because when you bring reinforcement learning together with deep learning, new things happen that don't happen when you consider reinforcement learning in, say, the tabular case. In effect, with deep reinforcement learning, the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. The interaction between RL and deep learning leads to novel phenomena, and that can give us new hypotheses to pursue in neuroscience. And I'll give you a couple examples of that. So let's just start. I'll give several examples. Let's just start, though, with these two papers. The paper on the left is one that some researchers in my group wrote together with Now. And the inspiration came from AI. There's been a lot of work over the last few years looking at the idea of generalizing reward, value, and prediction error signals, generalizing them from the scalar format that they usually assume in RL to a distributional representation. So instead of representing the expected value of this situation in this Pac-Man as a single number that summarizes the cumulative discounted return. Instead, the agent represents that value as a full probability distribution. So the agent here is saying, well, I might get 23 points, but I might get 29 points. And this humanoid jumping over this gap is thinking at first, oh, I think I'm going to make it, but there's a small chance I'll fall in. And then over time, the agent gets a little bit more worried that it's going to fall in. But over time, it's always representing a full probability distribution. In AI research, this has been shown to moving to this kind of distributional representation has given has paid off in spades in terms of agent learning speed and asymptotic performance. And by the way, that's already an indication of this kind of greater than the sum of its parts effect, because this is not an effect you see in the tabular case. You have to be using rich function approximation like we see in DeepRL in order for this distributional approach to pay off in performance. I can unpack that in the discussion if people are interested in the explanation for why. But let's move on, because I want to talk about implications of that observation from AI for neuroscience. So how does distributional temporal difference learning work in these agents? Well, instead of there being just one value representation and one reward prediction error representation, instead there's a whole series of channels that range from a kind of pessimistic bias to an optimistic bias about the future. And the diversity among these is driven by the inclusion of different multipliers for positive reward prediction errors and negative reward prediction errors. So the pessimistic channels have a higher multiplier for negative RPEs, and the optimistic channels, shown in red here, should have a larger multiplier for positive RPEs. And that, combined with the dynamics of temporal difference learning, leads these different RPE channels with different response functions to kind of spread out along the pessimism to optimism continuum, so that they all end up listening to value baselines that range from the pessimistic to the optimistic. And then when you have these two things, it can be shown that that implicitly gives you automatically gives you an implicit encoding of the full value distribution. So these are the three aspects of distributional TD that we look for in rodent brains, and we were able to gain some empirical evidence consistent with all three of those as predictions about dopaminergic function. So when we look at individual dopamine neurons, we see very different tuning curves. Some of them really scale up their responses in the positive reward prediction error domain relative to the negative, and others do the opposite. And these are just nine sample neurons, but there's a whole kind of smooth spectrum from bending upward to bending downward. As predicted by distributional TD, we also see that these neurons differ in terms of the value baseline that they're listening to, whether they're pessimistic or optimistic. And you can tell whether a neuron is pessimistic or optimistic based on the change in its response as you deliver rewards that increase in magnitude. There's some point at which the neuron goes from dipping in its activity when you give that reward to increasing its activity. And when it flips, when it crosses the origin, as it were, you know that's where its a priori prediction lives. And different, consistent with distributional TD, we see in the dopaminergic data that different dopamine neurons flip from negative to positive responses at different reward magnitudes, different volumes of juice. This is just something that you wouldn't see in a classical TD system, but it looks very much like what you would expect from a distributional system. And then the third point I made about distributional TD is that if you have this diversity of channels, then dopaminergic responses should encode the full probability distribution over rewards. In simulations, we were able to show that if you assume the reward distribution that was involved in Now's actual experiments with rodents, and then you simulate a distributional TD system, and then try to decode from the quote unquote dopamine neurons in there what the reward distribution is, you can recover something that looks like the original reward distribution. At least you capture a multimodal profile. Whereas if you pretend that, if you start with a classical RL system and naively approach it as if it were a distributional system, you get garbage. You just get a Gaussian distribution. So when we apply the same approach to the actual dopamine neurons, we can recover some information about the multimodal structure of the reward distribution, which is a third piece of evidence that the dopamine system is doing something like those RL agents and encoding a full value distribution in its distributed activity. Okay, so that's just a bird's eye view of one study. This other study that we published in Nature Neuroscience a couple years ago is very different in its content and its objectives. So the idea here again comes from an observation in AI, and the observation is that if you start with a recurrent neural network, so a neural network that is able to maintain activity over time and has something like working memory, activity-based memory, you train that network using reinforcement learning. The delta here is supposed to be a reward prediction error signal that tunes the weights of this network. And you train it like an RL agent to go from observations of the environment to actions. But you also assume that it's trained in a multitask environment. So imagine instead of training this network just on one bandit task, you train it on a whole series of bandit tasks, which have different parameterizations, different reward probabilities. If you train a rather ordinary recurrent neural network using RL in that context, and then you freeze the weights in the system, so no more weight-based learning is going on. Reinforcement learning has stopped, and you now give it a new bandit problem and test it there, the agent actually does very well. It looks like it's learning how to handle this new bandit problem. If you quantify regret, it does pretty well, even compared to off-the-shelf machine learning algorithms. So how is it doing that? Well, it's using its activity-based memory. If you look inside the network and do dimensionality reduction on its hidden states, you can see it moving through a phase space. You can see if the correct action is the left action, you can see it, the internal representation sort of migrating toward one particular attractor. If the correct answer was the other action, that they migrate to another attractor. And if the problem's very hard, they kind of equivocate before they land in one of those two places. Hopefully, this is reminding some of you of work that Anne mentioned yesterday that she's done on how working memory can support reinforcement learning. In this computational framework, we see how that kind of working memory function can grow out of synaptic-based learning driven by reinforcement learning. And we can go further with the analogy to biological decision-making if we're willing to view this recurrent neural network as a very abstracted model of the recurrent connectivity that supports working memory in prefrontal cortical circuits, and regard the reward prediction errors in this system as subserving the function that dopamine plays in tuning those circuits. If we're willing to make that mapping, then we get a whole bunch of explanations of seemingly disparate neuroscientific phenomena. So for example, we can look at prefrontal activity during performance of bandit tasks. This is from a study by Sasui and colleagues. They found neurons in prefrontal cortex that coded not only for the animal's choice, but also for the estimated value of each of the choices, and also for the history of actions and rewards. The PFC neurons showed a particular distribution of coding properties. And if you just train a recurrent neural network using reinforcement learning on exactly the same task, you find something hauntingly similar, the same variables being coded for in the same proportions. Because the recurrent neural network is trained with a reinforcement learning algorithm, we can also look at the reward prediction error signals that arise. And that gives us a way of accounting for very interesting phenomena that have been reported in the dopamine literature. So just to give you an example, this is based on a study by Bromberg, Martin, and colleagues, which many of you will know. The animal fixated centrally, and then a left or right target was presented, and the animal simply had to saccade to the target. But sometimes the left target was associated with reward, and other times the right target was associated with the reward. And the reversals between these two states were signaled only by the reward outcome. So the animal had to kind of had to learn through experience that there was this block structure, and it had to infer from the reward outcomes themselves whether a reversal had occurred. And the dopamine recordings that Ethan did showed that in fact the monkey was doing that kind of inference. So if the left target had been rewarded for a while, then when the left target comes on, dopamine neurons get very excited. That's sort of a classical result. But now let's consider a case where immediately after that that stimulus occurs, the animal saccades to it, but fails to get a reward. Now, a savvy animal knows that a reversal has occurred, and this shows up in the responses of dopamine neurons to the very next trial. So if the right target shows up on the next trial, dopamine neurons are, sorry, I misspoke. If the left target shows up again on the next trial, dopamine neurons are disappointed, and that makes sense because the animal just experienced that the left target is no longer rewarded. But the interesting case is, what happens if the first stimulus after the reversal is the right target? So the last time the animal saw this target, it was not rewarded. But now the animal's in a position to know that a reversal has occurred and should be able to infer, if it's intelligent, that this stimulus will now be rewarded. And in fact, dopamine neurons seem to, quote unquote, know this. They show a peak rather than a dip in their activity. So when we train our recurrent neural network with a deep reinforcement learning algorithm on this same exact task setup, and then look at the reward prediction errors, treating them as models of dopaminergic activity, we see exactly the same thing. we see this inferred value effect. Why? Because the value estimates that are being used as a basis for reward prediction errors are based on the internal representations in the recurrent network. The recurrent network can represent the history of actions and outcomes, and it's been trained in this task, so it has every opportunity to learn the structure of the task. And that combination of factors allows the RPE signal to show this kind of intelligence. Hopefully this is reminding you of results that Mark presented yesterday about inferred value. Let me make a couple of other connections to some talks from yesterday. So
Matt, can I just jump in for 1 second? Just you have about 5 minutes left, okay?
Yeah, cool. Yeah, that's great. So Melissa talked about dopamine signals listening to cognitive map representations that live in the medial temporal lobe. DeepRL gives us a way of thinking about those. Some of you will know this paper from Andrea Bonino and colleagues at DeepMind that showed that you can get the spontaneous emergence of grid-like representations in deep neural networks that are simply trained on dead reckoning, but then went on to show that if you build that same grid code into a larger reinforcement learning agent and then train the whole thing with deep reinforcement learning, on a behavioral level, you get agents that are able to do extremely clever things that suggest that they have a really rich cognitive map. For example, using egocentric visual inputs to navigate around multi-room environments, dealing with dynamic obstacles like open and closed doors. Those of you who were around yesterday to hear Rashan's excellent talk heard her mention something referred to as the cost of cognitive control. There's a lot of evidence now that humans and perhaps other animals are reluctant, as it were, to exert cognitive control, that there's a cost associated with it. But it's been a longstanding mystery in the field why this should be the case. There's no satisfying normative account for why cognitive control should be costly. And I'll just mention, since I have limited time, that deep reinforcement learning provides a kind of intriguing hypothesis here, something that Wouter Kool and I described in a recent paper. The basic idea is if you have a cost of control, then that leads to the emergence of useful habits that are useful across multiple tasks. So obviously, I'm just giving you a bird's eye view of many pieces of work in deep reinforcement learning to give you a sense of the breadth of applicability of these tools. We went into much greater depth in these examples and others in this paper that we published recently, making essentially the same argument. Before I wrap up and we move to discussion, though, I just want to make a few points about what deep reinforcement learning is not. And the idea here is to sort of fend off what might otherwise arise as sort of misunderstandings of what I'm arguing for. So first of all, deep reinforcement learning is not synonymous with end-to-end RL. So in the Atari paper, all the representation learning in the system was driven purely by reinforcement learning signals, by reward prediction errors. That is one way to do things, but it's not the only way to do things in deep RL. And in fact, it's actually quite rare now in AI work to rely only on gradients coming from reward prediction errors. So another way to do things is, for example, to use unsupervised learning to carry some of the weight of representation learning, and then to combine that with reinforcement learning at some point in the system. I'm just going to flash papers here that come from my group that are on relevant topics. So this is a paper that we just put on archive about unsupervised learning in deep learning systems. And it has some cool relationship to inferotemporal activity. Another possible misunderstanding is that deep RL means backprop. Of course, backprop is ubiquitously used in AI work, but there are other ways of training deep neural networks, and they can be used with RL. In fact, we just put a paper on bioRxiv presenting an alternative to backprop that may, we argue, bear some relationship to biological learning. Deep RL is not even just TD learning. So There are plenty of ways of doing reinforcement learning without reward prediction errors. Policy gradient has been used in some deep RL work. Of course, model-based methods are quite ubiquitous, and their application is growing. RL is really defined in terms of the problem, not the algorithm. But the fact that we do often use TD learning is, of course, relevant to dopamine, and that's why it comes up all the time. Another possible misunderstanding, nobody claims that deep RL is a solved problem. In fact, we just put a paper on arXiv describing a task that requires latent state inference, and deep RL agents do terribly on it. There's still room for deep RL agents to overcome problems that relate to things that animals and humans are pretty good at. Deep RL is not necessarily big science. Of course, some of these big companies like DeepMind use gigantic computers in order to do what we do, but there's plenty of room for pioneering research, especially on the neuroscience side, that can be done in small scale. The work that I described earlier from our group is of that nature. And finally, I just want to say, I want to acknowledge that it's important that deep RL work in AI is not computational neuroscience. It might be useful as a framework, but most of the work that AI researchers are doing is not done in order to explain brain function. And so we run into this kind of funny problem where AI researchers like to talk about the question of whether understanding the brain might be relevant to AI by saying, well, if you were trying to build an airplane, only certain things about bird flight would be relevant. The fact that birds have feathers is not relevant. So there are certain things about understanding birds that might be misleading. We have the same issue in neuroscience when we look at these deep RL models from AI. There are probably a lot of things about them that are not biologically plausible, and that might prove to be red herrings. Okay, so I'm just showing here, just a very small fraction of the collaborators who are involved in the pieces of work that I flew through in this presentation. I want to thank them and thank you, and I'm looking forward to discussion.